Everyone calls Richard Kuklinski the deadliest hitman the Mafia ever produced, a man who claimed to have ended more than 200 lives. But the agent who got close enough to catch him said something different. He could prove 5, maybe being generous, 15. So which is true? Was the Iceman a one-man army handling the mob's most famous jobs? Or a man who built a monster out of his own words? Here is what the evidence shows. The legend was mostly invented from a prison cell. The real man was a violent New Jersey criminal, proven responsible for only a handful of lives, most of them his own partners and contacts. And his surest harm was done not to gangsters, but to the family living quietly inside his own home. Across this video, we will separate every claim from every fact, follow the real cases, the trick behind his nickname, the sting that caught him, and the legend he built afterward, until the real man underneath comes into view. Section 1. The Boy from Jersey City. Richard Leonard Kuklinski was born on April 11, 1935, in Jersey City, New Jersey. That date and place are two of the very few things about his early years that can be checked against solid records. Almost everything else we think we know about his childhood comes from one source: Richard himself, telling his own story decades later from a prison cell. That is worth holding on to from the very start. The man at the center of all this was, by the account of nearly everyone who looked into him, a gifted and practiced liar. So when we talk about where he came from, we have to keep two piles separate. One pile is what can be proven. The other is simply what he said. Here is what sits in the first pile. His father, Stanley, came from a Polish immigrant family and worked as a brakeman on the railroad. His mother, Anna, came from an Irish family, took a job in a meatpacking plant, and raised her children as strict Roman Catholics. They were poor. They lived in a rough corner of the city. Richard was the second of 4 children, and the home was not a kind one. By Richard's own telling, and through the accounts later gathered in books about him, his father was a violent man who hurt his children badly and often, while his mother was cold and harsh in her own way. Those claims are hard to fully confirm so many years later, but one piece of the family story does not rest on Richard's word alone, and it is a heavy one. His older brother, Florian, lost his life as a young boy, around the age of 8. It was officially put down to an illness. Inside the family, though, the understanding passed quietly along was that the boy had been hurt by their father, and that the real story was kept from the authorities. Whatever the full truth, Richard grew up in a house where a child had already been lost. There is a second fact here that needs no faith in Richard's honesty at all, because it played out in open court. Richard had a younger brother named Joseph. In 1970, Joseph was convicted of a terrible crime that took the life of a 12-year-old girl. This is not something Richard made up to sound dangerous. It is part of the public record, completely separate from anything Richard ever claimed. Years later, when someone asked Richard about what his brother had done, he gave an answer that has followed the family ever since. He said, plainly, that they came from the same father. In one short line, he tied his brother's darkness and his own back to the same root. So that is the ground this man grew out of. A poor home, a brother lost too young, a father remembered for his temper, and a sibling who would go on to do something monstrous. That kind of beginning can shape a person, though it does not hand out excuses. And Richard, for whatever it is worth, never asked anyone to give him one. Then comes the part that surprises people most. For all the violence that would later attach to his name, Richard Kuklinski spent years living as an ordinary suburban husband and father. As a young man, he held regular jobs, including a stretch at a trucking company. It was there that he met a young woman named Barbara Pedrici, a secretary at the same firm. He was in his mid-20s. She was barely out of her teens. He had already been married once before to a woman named Linda and had 2 sons with her. That first marriage ended, and in 1961 he married Barbara. Together they would have 3 more children, 2 daughters and a son. The family put down roots in Dumont, New Jersey, a quiet town where neighbors mowed their lawns and waved hello over the fence. To everyone around him, Richard looked like a success story. He told people he was a businessman, a wholesale distributor, and he had the house, the pool, and the nice car to make the story believable. He even kept an accountant. On Sundays, the family went to church, where Richard helped out as an usher. He hosted weekend cookouts in the backyard. His wife and children had no real idea what he actually did to pay for any of it. This is the strange split that sits at the heart of everything. The same man who walked through church doors with a calm, friendly face on Sunday morning was building a very different reputation somewhere else, as a person you did not want to upset. And even at home, the warmth the neighbors imagined was not the whole picture. Barbara would later describe a husband who could be loving one minute and frightening the next. A man whose temper could turn sharp and cold without warning. She has said she married him partly out of fear of what he might do if she said no. What she describes is not a cartoon villain. It is something quieter and more unsettling. A dangerous man hiding in plain sight, in a normal house, on a normal street. For a long stretch, the trick held. The 2 halves of his life stayed apart, and the people closest to him lived for years inside a story that was not true, never once guessing that the man at the dinner table had another line of work none of them could have pictured. But nobody goes from a poor kid in Jersey City to a name spoken carefully in mob circles by accident. Something happened in the years in between, a slow drift from small-time street trouble toward the work that would one day define him. To understand how that quiet family man crossed the line, we have to follow him out of the suburbs and into the rooms where the real business got done. Section 2. Where the legend begins. To understand how a quiet suburban husband turned into a name people spoke carefully, you have to look at what he was really doing while the neighbors believed he was just a businessman. The honest answer is that for years he was a criminal, but a fairly small one. His first steady money on the wrong side of the law came from films. Richard set up a modest little operation, making and selling bootleg copies of movies. Some were ordinary popular films, some were adult films that were never legal for him to copy in the first place. It was simple, repeatable, illegal income, and his family had no idea any of it was happening. Around the same time, he was teaming up with other men to steal cars and break into places, and, bit by bit, he pulled together a small crew of his own that ran burglaries across northern New Jersey. None of this is glamorous. It is the everyday grind of a working criminal. Copy, steal, sell, do it again. That bootleg film business, though, turned out to be a doorway into something larger. The people who controlled that kind of trade had ties to organized crime, and dealing with them pulled Richard into the same circles. One man he got to know stands out, a local figure named Phil Soliman, who became about the closest thing Richard ever had to a real friend. Hold on to that name. Soliman matters enormously later on, and not in a way Richard would have ever wanted. Now, we reach the spot where it pays to slow down and be careful, because this is exactly where what can be proven and what Richard simply claimed begin to split apart. By Richard's own account, his step up into the big leagues happened like this. He came to owe money to a feared mob figure named Roy DeMeo, a real and genuinely dangerous member of the Gambino crime family. DeMeo, the story goes, sent men to rough Richard up over the debt. Instead of crumbling, Richard took the punishment without complaint, paid back what he owed, and somehow earned DeMeo's respect through how unbothered he stayed. After that, Richard said, he was pulled in close and started running errands, collecting debts, and handling the rougher jobs for DeMeo and the Gambino family. He told an even darker story about how he supposedly proved himself. Richard claimed DeMeo once drove him out, parked on a city street, pointed at a total stranger walking by, and ordered him to deal with the man on the spot, with no reason given. Richard said he calmly stepped out of the car and did exactly that, right there in public, and that this cold display is what made him DeMeo's favorite. It is a chilling story. It is also a story that leans almost entirely on Richard's own word. And that is the trouble. When investigators and crime historians went looking for proof of this grand mob career, much of it fell apart in their hands. Several members of DeMeo's actual crew later turned informant and described their world in great detail, yet not one of them ever mentioned Richard Kuklinski. Jerry Capisi, a respected crime journalist who wrote the definitive book about DeMeo's crew, doubted the link. Michael Francis, a former high-ranking mob figure who spent decades inside that life, said he never once heard Richard's name back when he was active, and openly called him a liar. To be fair, it is not perfectly one-sided. Years afterward, one former associate did step forward and claim that Richard really had moved around handling jobs tied to the Gambino family's film operations. So it is not impossible that he genuinely brushed up against that world. But there is a vast gap between brushing up against the Mafia and being its prized right hand, and the real evidence sits far closer to the smaller version. Here is the cleanest way to carry all of this forward. What is solid is plenty disturbing on its own. Richard Kuklinski was a real, active criminal for years, running bootleg films, taking part in thefts, and leading his own burglary crew, with at least some genuine contact with the organized crime world. What is shaky is everything grander stacked on top of that. The picture of a globe-trotting hitman trusted with the mob's most sensitive work, with hundreds of lives on his hands. That bigger picture comes mostly from Richard himself, told from a cell years later, and the people best placed to confirm it mostly could not. The legend and the record describe two different men, and only one of them can actually be backed up. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So when people connected to Richard finally started turning up, and they did, the smartest move is to ask one simple question that slices straight through the myth. Forget who Richard said he answered to. Look instead at exactly who came to harm and at what those people had in common with one another. The answer is not at all what the legend would lead you to expect, and it reveals far more about the real man than any tale he ever spun from behind bars. Section 3. The names on the record. When you stop listening to the legend and start counting the people who can actually be tied to Richard Kuklinski, a small and very specific list appears. It is not a list of mob bosses. It is not a roll call of famous gangland figures taken out in fancy restaurants. It is a list of ordinary men who made the mistake of doing business with him or working alongside him. 5 names sit at the heart of it. And once you see what they share, the real shape of who Richard was becomes hard to miss. The first name the authorities could firmly attach to him was George Maliband. In 1980, Maliband met with Richard over a deal involving videotapes, and he was carrying a large amount of cash. He never made it home. Sometime later, his remains were discovered stuffed inside a metal drum in Jersey City. A man had come to do business over money, and he ended up gone. The second name is the one that handed Richard his famous nickname. Louis Mazgay was a businessman from Pennsylvania who ran a small shop and came looking to buy goods from Richard, again with a thick roll of money on him. In 1981, he vanished. His remains were not found for well over a year, and when they finally were, the examination turned up something strange. There were ice crystals in his tissue, Mazgay had been kept frozen for a long stretch before being dumped, almost certainly to scramble any guess about when he had actually lost his life. That single detail, a man preserved in the cold to hide the timeline, is where the name the Iceman comes from. It was never about the deeds being cold, it was about the freezer. Notice the pattern already forming. Maliband and Mazgay were not enemies of any crime family. They were small-time dealers and traders, drawn to a meeting by the promise of a deal, both holding serious money when they showed up. Both were taken out with a firearm. There was no shadowy order from the top. The reason was the cash in their pockets, and whatever business had soured between them. The next two names are different, and in a way they say even more. Gary Smith and Daniel Deppner were not outsiders at all. They were part of Richard's own burglary crew. They worked beside him, and that is exactly why they came to harm. By the early 1980s, the law was beginning to circle the crew, and Richard grew afraid that one of his own men might start talking. So he set about removing the risk. Gary Smith was handled first. A deadly substance was slipped into food he was given. And when that did not finish the job fast enough, the rest was done another way. His remains were hidden in a motel room, pushed out of sight, and were only found after a smell drew someone's attention. Daniel Deppner came next. His remains turned up in 1983, left out in a wooded area and stumbled upon by a passerby. Two men who had trusted Richard enough to run with him were gone, for no reason beyond the fact that they had become a danger to him. The fifth name is Paul Hoffman. In 1982, Hoffman came to Richard hoping to buy prescription medication. He was never seen again. Unlike the others, Hoffman's remains were never recovered at all. Richard later admitted to this one, but with nothing to find and little hard proof, the charges in that case could not hold. Hoffman is a reminder that the official list is almost certainly not the full story, only the part that could be nailed down. It was this very pattern that first pulled the police toward Richard in a serious way. Investigators began to notice that a string of men last seen alive in his company had a habit of turning up gone, and that thread is what eventually tightened around him. But step back and look at the five together. A man selling videotapes, a shopkeeper buying goods, a man after medication, and two members of his own crew. Not one of them was a rival gangster. Not one was a job ordered from the top of some family. Every single one was someone inside Richard's own small world of deals, theft, and quiet business, and most were carrying either cash or secrets he wanted buried. This is the part the legend works hardest to hide. The man who claimed to be the Mafia's deadliest weapon, sent across the country to bring down its biggest enemies, leaves behind a proven trail that looks nothing like that boast. It looks instead like a robber and a crew boss cleaning up his own messes, taking the money when it was there, and silencing the people who got too close. Frightening, yes, but ordinary in its motives, and very human in its greed and its fear. So this raises a question that nagged at investigators for years. If Richard left behind a trail like this, men he had openly dealt with, crew members who worked at his side, then why on earth did it take so long to catch him? The answer is buried in how he carried these things out, in a set of cold, careful habits designed to wipe away the one piece of evidence every case depends on. And the freezing of Louis Mazgay, it turns out, was only the start of it. Section 4. Built to leave no trace. The reason Richard stayed free for so long was not some magic weapon or special talent. It was a set of cold, practical habits, and almost all of them came down to one goal: making sure the police had nothing solid to work with. Two of those habits stand out, and together they explain why a man with such an obvious trail kept slipping through the cracks for years. The first habit was simple variety. Richard did not have one signature way of doing things. One time it was a firearm. Another time it was a fast-acting poison slipped into food. Another time it was done by hand. Because the cases looked so different from one another, police were slow to even realize they were dealing with a single person. A killing that happens 3 different ways in 3 different towns does not scream one man. It scrambles the picture. That confusion was not an accident. It was protection. The second habit was far more calculated, and it is the one that gave him his nickname. Richard had learned that if you freeze a body and dump it later, you can wreck the one thing every investigation leans on, which is the timeline. The clearest example is Louis Masguet. When Masguet was finally found, well over a year after he vanished, he looked oddly fresh, as if he had only just been dumped. That alone was strange. Stranger still, the decay on him was happening from the outside in, which is backwards from how a body normally breaks down. A sharp medical examiner noticed both oddities and went looking deeper, and inside the heart he found ice crystals. The body had been kept frozen for a long time. Richard had stored it away and dumped it much later, hoping that by the time anyone found Masguet, no one could ever pin down when he had actually lost his life. Think about how clever and cold that is. If the police cannot say when something happened, they cannot test a suspect's alibi because there is no date to check him against. Freezing attacks the case at its foundation. Richard paired it with other careful moves, dumping remains far from where the person had last been seen, sometimes across a state line, and in some cases reportedly stripping away anything that could quickly reveal who the person even was. The whole approach was built around a single idea: give the authorities a puzzle with the corners missing. And it very nearly worked on Masguet. The one thing that tripped him up was a small mistake. He did not let the body thaw fully before dumping it, and that leftover ice is exactly what gave the trick away. Had he been a little more patient, the timeline might have stayed a mystery for good. His preferred poison was part of the same thinking. He leaned on a fast-acting substance in part because it is genuinely hard to detect after a person is gone. It breaks down in the body within days and leaves almost no trace behind, not even a smell. For a while, that made these cases extremely tough to prove, since investigators could not easily point to how the person had died at all. But clever is not the same as perfect. When the case finally went to court, prosecutors brought in some of the most respected medical examiners in the country, and they knew exactly what to look for. They pointed to faint pinkish marks on the skin, a sign that the body had been starved of oxygen, and to marks around the neck. Put together, those quiet clues told the real story, even without a clear trace of the poison itself. The method was smart. It was just not as untouchable as Richard believed. Now, an honest word about the rest. If you only listen to Richard, his toolkit sounds like something out of an action movie, full of dramatic and exotic weapons and elaborate schemes. The trouble is that most of that comes from his own storytelling, told years later, with no proof to back it up. One of his most disturbing claims about leaving a person in a remote spot to a horrible fate was actually checked by a local expert who knew the area well, and it simply did not hold up. No sign of it was ever found. The real, provable toolkit is much narrower and much more ordinary. A firearm, a poison, his own hands, and a freezer. Less theatrical, but in truth more unsettling, because it is so plain and so patient. That is the version of Richard that the evidence supports. Not a flashy superweapon for the mob, but a careful, practical man who treated covering his tracks as the real job. He was not trying to put on a show. He was trying to make sure that when a person disappeared, there was as little left behind as possible for anyone to follow. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. For years, that approach gave him exactly what he wanted. The cases sat cold, the timelines stayed muddy, the connections stayed hidden. But every one of these tricks was built to defeat physical evidence, and none of them could protect him from the one thing he could never quite freeze or wash away, which was his own voice. In the end, what brought Richard down was not a body or a fingerprint. It was a stranger who slowly earned his trust and got him talking, while a hidden recorder caught every careless word. And the man who quietly opened that door had been standing close to Richard the entire time. Section 5. Caught by his own words. For years, the people whose job was to stop Richard kept hitting the same wall. They had a strong hunch. They had a growing list of men who had last been seen in his company and then turned up gone. What they did not have was proof a court would accept. His careful habits had done their work, and a hunch is not a case. The first real crack came from a determined investigator named Pat Kane, who started out looking into a string of burglaries in northern New Jersey. As Kane dug, he noticed the unsettling pattern we walked through earlier. A handful of men tied to Richard had simply stopped existing. Kane grew certain that one man sat at the center of all of it. But certainty is not evidence, and for a long stretch the case went nowhere. Richard had built his whole approach around making sure of exactly that. So the authorities changed their entire plan. If they could not find the physical proof, they would chase the one thing Richard could never bury, hide, or freeze. They would get him to talk. A joint task force came together, pulling in the New Jersey Attorney General's office and federal agents whose bureau also handled the kind of illegal trade Richard dabbled in on the side. The effort got a fitting name. They called it Operation Iceman. Here is where one of the saddest threads in the whole story pays off. Remember Phil Solimene, described as about the only real friend Richard ever had? When the pressure came down, Solimene chose to help the authorities. He agreed to vouch for an outsider, to open the one door no stranger could have walked through alone. The man he opened it for was a federal agent named Dominic Polifrone, working deep undercover and posing as a fellow criminal looking to hire someone for serious work. This was the masterstroke, and it was patient. Polifrone did not barge in demanding details. He played his part, built trust slowly, and let Richard do the thing Richard loved most, which was talk about himself. Across many meetings, in cars and at roadside stops, Polifrone kept a hidden recorder running while Richard calmly described his favorite methods in his own matter-of-fact voice. He talked about his liking for a certain fast-acting substance, how quiet and clean it was, and how he had used it on people in plain sight without anyone nearby noticing. Every careless word went onto tape. The man who had spent years making sure he left nothing behind was now handing the authorities a recorded confession, one sentence at a time, simply because he could not resist showing off to someone he believed was a friend of a friend. When they had enough, they set the final trap. Polifrone dangled a job in front of Richard, a wealthy young buyer who was supposedly carrying a large bag of cash and needed to be dealt with. The plan, as Richard understood it, was to slip the man a doctored egg sandwich and then take the money. Polifrone even offered to supply the substance himself. What he actually handed over was harmless. It was quinine, mixed up in a state police lab to look the part, completely unable to hurt anyone. The handoff happened on December 17, 1986, at a rest stop along the New Jersey Turnpike. Polifrone gave Richard the egg sandwich and the fake substance, and that was the moment the trap snapped shut. The authorities moved in. Richard was taken into custody, and the telltale sandwich was found among his things. His wife, Barbara, was right there beside him, heading out on an ordinary errand with absolutely no idea that the man she had lived with for 25 years was being arrested as the person behind a string of disappearances. In a single moment, the quiet suburban life and the hidden one slammed into each other in full view. And one of the investigators had the grim job of telling Barbara, as plainly as he could, what her husband had really been all those years. The search that followed turned up items tying Richard to his secret line of work, and the charges stacked up fast. He was formally accused in connection with 5 of the cases that had haunted the investigation, the very men whose vanishing had first pulled Pat Kane in, with more counts piled on top. It is worth sitting with the irony, because it is the whole heart of how this man was finally stopped. Every clever trick Richard had built worked exactly as designed. The freezing scrambled the timelines. The fast-acting substance left little to find. The scattered methods kept the cases from looking like the work of one person. Physical evidence, the thing he had spent years defeating, never did corner him. What cornered him was simpler and far more human. He liked the sound of his own voice. He trusted the wrong introduction, and he talked. The most careful man in the room was undone by the one habit he could not break. But an arrest is not the end of the road, and a stack of recordings is not the same as a guilty verdict. Richard had deliberately muddied the very timelines those cases depended on, and his lawyers would lean on exactly that. To turn the tapes and the suspicion into a conviction, prosecutors still had to walk into a courtroom and prove, with science rather than talk, how these men had lost their lives, when everything about the cases had been arranged from the start to keep that hidden. Section 6. The science that caught up with him. An arrest puts a man in handcuffs. It does not put him in prison. Between those two things sits a trial, and Richard's trial was far from a sure thing. The recordings were powerful, but on their own, they carried a weakness. On the tapes, Richard talked about his methods in general, the kinds of things he liked to do and had done. He never sat there and narrated, case by case, exactly how each specific man had lost his life. His lawyers planned to drive a truck straight through that gap. The main trial centered on the 2 members of his own crew, Gary Smith and Daniel Deppner. And here Richard's old cleverness almost saved him. His defense made a bold, simple argument. They told the court that the prosecution could not actually prove how these 2 men had lost their lives, because the substance suspected of being used breaks down inside a person and leaves almost nothing behind for anyone to find. This was not a desperate bluff. It was true. That particular substance really is one of the hardest things to pin down after the fact, which is a big part of why Richard had favored it in the first place. Remove the clear cause, the defense reasoned, and you remove the case. The prosecution's answer was to bring in some of the sharpest forensic minds in the country and let the science do the talking. The standout was Dr. Michael Baden, one of the most respected medical examiners in America. Baden laid the problem out for the jury and then solved it. Yes, he agreed. The substance itself fades within days, leaving no direct trace, and not even a telltale smell. But its effect does not disappear with it. When a person is starved of oxygen in that particular way, it leaves a faint, pinkish marking on the skin, a quiet signature of what happened. And that marking showed up in the case images. A second expert, Dr. Geetha Natarajan, pointed to marks around the neck that told their own part of the story. Between them, the 2 experts rebuilt the truth out of small, indirect clues, filling the exact hole the defense had tried to open. Then came the part that tied everything together. The jury did not only hear scientists describe how these men had likely come to harm. They got to hear Richard himself. The hidden recordings were played in the courtroom, and in his own steady, untroubled voice, the jurors listened to him describe the very kinds of methods the experts were laying out on the stand. The science explained what had been done. The tapes revealed a man who spoke about doing those things as casually as someone discussing the weather. Placed side by side, the 2 were almost impossible to argue against. In 1988, the jury found Richard guilty. There was, though, one real limit to how far the case could reach. No living witness had ever actually seen him in the act. Everything rested on the science and the recordings, strong as they were.
And that missing eyewitness is the reason he was spared the harshest possible sentence. Instead, he was handed life behind bars, with the terms stacked one after another in a way that turned the math almost grimly absurd.
By the official count, Richard would not even be eligible to ask for release until he was somewhere around 110 years old. In plain words, he was never getting out. After the verdict, rather than drag himself through a second courtroom fight over the remaining cases, Richard changed course and simply admitted to two more, the deals that had ended the lives of George Maliband and Louis Masgay. He also confessed to what had happened to Paul Hoffman, but since Hoffman was never found and there was nothing solid to build on, those particular charges were quietly dropped. When the dust finally settled, the official tally of cases proven against him was small, a handful of men, all from inside his own little world of theft and shady deals. Every one of them established not through some grand, dramatic confession, but through patient science and his own careless voice on tape. It is worth pausing on how ordinary in its way that final legal picture really is. This is the court-tested record of the man the world would come to call the deadliest figure the underworld ever produced. Not hundreds of names, not famous gangland bosses. A small group of associates and business contacts, proven through skin markings, neck marks, and recordings. Everything grander than that, every tale of crossing the country to bring down the powerful, sat completely outside that courtroom. No judge weighed it. No jury tested it. It never had to survive a defense lawyer trying to tear it apart. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Most people, once locked away for good, go quiet and slowly fade out of memory. Richard did the exact opposite, opening up from his cell to psychiatrists, to writers, and eventually to television cameras rolling right in front of him. And it was there, with no lawyer to object and no jury to satisfy, that the small, provable story of a New Jersey criminal began to swell into the towering legend of the Iceman. Section 7. The legend he built himself. Locked away for good, with no parole to hope for and nothing left to protect, Richard found a brand new role. He became a storyteller. From inside Trenton State Prison, the maximum security facility where he would spend the rest of his days, he started doing the one thing he had always been good at, but had never been able to do in public. He talked about himself, on the record, for the whole world to hear. The results turned him into a household name in true crime. Two journalists sat with him at length and shaped those conversations into books, the first published in 1993 and the second in 2006. Then came television. The cable network HBO produced 3 separate documentaries about him in 1992, in 2001, and in 2003. Each one built around long stretches of Richard speaking straight into the camera. For most people alive today, this is the only Richard Kuklinski they have ever met. Not the court record, not the trial, but a heavy-set older man in a prison shirt, calmly describing terrible things. The most striking of these sit-downs was with Dr. Park Dietz, one of the most respected forensic psychiatrists in the country, a man who had previously studied some of America's most infamous figures. Dietz spent around 16 hours with Richard, and he did not simply nod along. He pushed, he questioned, he poked holes, and at times, Richard grew openly irritated with him. But Richard kept talking, because talking was the entire point. And here is what hooked millions of viewers. It was not anything graphic that made the footage unforgettable. It was the calm. Richard described the worst things he had ever done in the same flat, unbothered tone a man might use to talk about fixing a leaky sink. That eerie steadiness, more than any single story, is what built the myth. And the myth grew with every telling. Early on, Richard spoke of around 100 lives. As the interviews went on and the cameras kept rolling, the figure climbed, eventually pushing past 200. He even sorted them into tidy groups, claiming that more than half were paid jobs for the Mafia and that dozens of others were done for no reason at all beyond his own satisfaction. Each new number landed bigger, darker, and more cinematic than the last, and there was no one in the room able to pause and check whether any of it was real. That is the crack running straight through the whole legend. The people best placed to test his claims have spent years saying the very same thing, which is that the stories do not hold up. The undercover agent who knew the case as well as anyone said he could firmly document only about 5 and would not go past roughly 15, even being generous. Another investigator who worked the arrest said that when he went back and checked the cases Richard bragged about, not a single one held together. A former high-ranking mob figure, someone who had spent decades inside that world, said he had never once heard Richard's name back when he was active, and flatly called him a liar. When Richard claimed a hand in a famous vanishing that has gripped the country for decades, a former federal agent said plainly that he had never even been a suspect. Even one of the authors who built a whole book around him later admitted that one of Richard's biggest mob claims was simply not true. So why invent so much? We cannot know for certain, but a few reasonable explanations sit right on the surface. He was already going to spend the rest of his life behind bars, which meant admitting to more cost him absolutely nothing. The attention almost certainly fed something in him, handing a powerless man trapped in a cell the feeling of being important and feared all over again. And it may simply be that a habit of puffing himself up had always been part of who he was. Whatever the mix, the result was the same. Every interview gave him a fresh chance to make himself far larger than the small, grubby reality of his proven crimes. There is a quiet irony buried in all of this, and it is easy to miss. The legend Richard built actually flattered him. By recasting himself as a globe-trotting professional for the mob, he wrapped his life in a kind of dark glamour, the cool and untouchable specialist out of 100 movies. But the more honest, better documented picture is smaller and sadder. It is the picture of a man whose worst and most certain damage was done not on some far-off job, but right inside his own home, where his wife and children lived under the weight of his temper and his threats. The interviews tended to glide right past that part. The myth of the master operator was, in a strange way, more comfortable for everyone, Richard included, than the plain truth of the frightening man at the dinner table. But one of those late confessions did something far more dangerous than simply pad his legend. It reached out from his cell and dropped a real, living man squarely into a courtroom. In one of his final interviews, Richard named a name, and that single claim would tie him to one of the most famous turncoats in the history of the American mob, in a case that would come apart in the strangest way imaginable. Section 8. The Iceman and the Bull. Most of Richard's prison confessions drifted harmlessly out into the world. They shocked people, they sold books, and they could not really touch anyone because the cases were old, the proof was thin, and the only voice behind them was his. But one confession was different. One of them named another living man, and that changed everything. In one of his HBO interviews, broadcast in 2001, Richard admitted to something that had never been pinned on him before. On a cold night back in March 1980, a man named Peter Calabro had lost his life on a quiet road in Upper Saddle River, New Jersey. Calabro was not a small-time dealer or a member of Richard's crew. He was a detective with the New York Police Department. For more than 20 years, his case had sat unsolved. Now, on camera, Richard calmly claimed it as his own work.
The way he told it, the job was cold and patient, just like his old habits. He said he parked his van across a narrow road so passing cars had to slow down, then lay waiting in a snowbank in the dark.
When Calabro's car finally came by in the early hours, Richard stepped out and finished it with a single weapon, then slipped away into the night. He even added a chilling detail. He claimed he had not known Calabro was a police detective at the time, but said it would not have changed a thing if he had. For prosecutors, this was explosive because of who Richard said had sent him. He claimed the job had been arranged by Salvatore Gravano, far better known by his nickname, Sammy the Bull. And Gravano was no shadowy figure lost to history. He was one of the most famous turncoats in American mob history, the former second-in-command of the Gambino family, the man who had flipped and helped the government bring down the notorious boss, John Gotti. Gravano had openly admitted a hand in 19 lives lost across his criminal career, served a short sentence in exchange for his cooperation, and then, years later, locked up again for running a large operation selling illegal pills out west. In February 2003, prosecutors in New Jersey acted on Richard's claim. They formally charged Gravano with arranging the Calabro case, alleging he had hired Richard for the job and even supplied the weapon. The very next day, Richard pleaded guilty to being the one who carried it out. His deal was almost a formality. He accepted an extra 30-year term to run alongside the sentence he was already serving, which, for a man who was never getting out anyway, changed nothing about the rest of his life. On paper, the case looked strong. The prosecutor leading it said he did not even need to explain a motive because he had a confession and a guilty plea from the man who claimed responsibility. But here the story takes the strange turn that defines it. Gravano flatly denied any part in the Calabro case. He was even offered a deal of his own, one that would have added no extra prison time if he simply admitted it and named his accomplices. And he turned it down cold, insisting he had nothing to do with it. That left the entire case against Gravano balanced on a single pillar. Everything hung on Richard taking the witness stand and telling the story under oath, where it could finally be tested. That day never came. On March 5, 2006, before he could ever testify, Richard passed away inside a prison medical wing. And with him went the only real evidence tying Gravano to the Calabro case. There was no physical proof, no second witness, nothing to hold the charge together once the storyteller himself was gone. Within a short time, the case against Gravano simply fell apart, and the charges were dropped. The one confession that had reached out of Richard's cell and seized a living man let go of him entirely the instant Richard stopped breathing. The questions did not end there. Years later, Gravano offered his own explanation for the whole episode. He claimed that another locked-up mob associate had quietly fed Richard the details of the Calabro case on purpose, handing him just enough to sound believable so that Richard would point the finger at Gravano. The motive, by this account, was revenge, payback for Gravano breaking the mob's code and testifying against his own family. There is no way now to prove or disprove that version, but it fits a pattern we have seen over and over in this story. Richard loved a dramatic confession. He was easily handed a script that made him look bigger than he was, and once he repeated something on camera, it took on a life of its own. So the Calabro affair ends up being almost a perfect little model of the entire Iceman puzzle. A real and serious case. A genuine person who lost his life, and a confession delivered with total confidence, all tangled together with doubt, hidden motives, and a story that could never quite be locked down. Was Richard truly the one who took Calabro that night, working for Gravano as he claimed? Or was he simply repeating a tale someone else had placed in his mouth? Like so much of what he said, It sits forever just out of reach of certainty. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. There is, though, one detail here that refuses to sit quietly, and it is the timing. Richard passed away at the precise moment he was most useful and most dangerous, right as he was about to take the stand and help put a famous mob figure away. For a man who claimed to have ended so many lives, the convenient end of his own raised an obvious and unsettling question, one people still argue about today. Had the Iceman finally been silenced himself? Section 9. The Quiet End. The suspicion was not crazy. Step back and look at the situation in early 2006. Here was a man who had spent years claiming to have ended more lives than anyone could count, now sitting in a prison medical wing, holding the one confession that could finally drop a famous mob figure into a cell for the rest of his days. He was the single piece holding the whole Gravano case together, and in the months before the end, Richard reportedly told members of his family something chilling. He said he believed someone was secretly making him ill, slowly, on purpose. For a story already swimming in mob ties and hidden motives, the pieces seemed to point towards something sinister. So it is worth walking carefully through what actually happened, because the plain facts tell a far quieter story than the rumor does. By 2005, after nearly 2 decades behind bars, Richard's health was breaking down. He was an old man now, and a sick one. That October, he was moved out of the regular prison and into the secure wing of a medical center in Trenton, New Jersey, where he could get proper care. The illness behind the move was an unusual one. By several accounts, it was a rare condition that inflames the vessels inside the body, the kind doctors more often see in the very young, and it sat on top of serious, long-running heart trouble. He was, in short, a large, aging, gravely ill man whose body was failing on several fronts at once. On March 5, 2006, inside that medical wing, Richard's life came to an end. He was 70 years old. Now, to the question everyone wanted answered. Given the timing, and given his own claim that someone was quietly making him ill, had he been silenced to keep him off that witness stand? The authorities checked. An examination after his passing reached a clear and far less dramatic conclusion. Richard had not been done away with by some shadowy hand. He had gone from natural causes, his worn-out heart and his serious illness finally catching up with him. Exactly the kind of ending you would expect for a man in his condition. There was no proof of any plot, no sign of foul play, nothing at all to support the idea that the Iceman had been removed before he could talk. The convenient timing was just that, a coincidence sitting on top of a body that had been giving out for months. But there is one detail about his final days that lands harder than any mob conspiracy ever could, precisely because it is so ordinary and so human. As his condition worsened, Richard reportedly asked the doctors to do everything they could to bring him back if his heart ever stopped. He wanted to be revived. He wanted to hang on. The decision, though, was not his to make. That power rested with Barbara, the woman he had married, controlled, and frightened for decades. The wife who had long since divorced him, but still held the authority to speak for him at the end. And by several accounts, Barbara signed a "do not resuscitate" order, an instruction telling the hospital not to fight to bring him back. Later, when staff called to ask whether she wanted to change her mind, she declined. Sit with that for a moment. The most feared man in the room, the one who had spent a lifetime deciding who carried on and who did not, reached his own end with that single decision taken completely out of his hands. and it was placed in the hands of the person who had perhaps the most reason of anyone to be finished with him. There is no need to dress that up or pass judgment on it. The plain fact carries all the weight it needs. In a strange way, even Richard's end fits the exact shape of his whole story. People wanted it to be as big and dramatic as the legend. A poisoning, a mob hit, the Iceman taken out before he could speak. The documented truth turned out to be smaller, sadder, and far more believable. An old, sick man's body simply quit. The only real drama at the close was not some underworld plot at all. It was the quiet, painful human story unfolding inside his own family, the very place where his most certain damage had always been done. And so the legal chapter finally closed. The cases were settled or dropped, the witness was gone, and the freezer, the recordings, and the courtroom battles all belonged to the past. By any normal measure, that should have been the end of Richard Kuklinski. A convicted criminal quietly leaves the world in prison, and everyone moves on and forgets. That is not even close to what happened. In the years after his passing, the story did the opposite of fade. As the books kept selling, the chilling interview footage found brand new audiences who had not even been born when he was arrested. And Hollywood eventually turned his life into a major motion picture. Which leaves the real question this whole story has been quietly building toward. Once you strip the myth all the way down to the floor, what are we actually supposed to make of the man left standing underneath? Section 10. The Monster We Wanted. After Richard was gone, the strangest thing happened. Instead of fading, he got famous. The recordings of those prison interviews spread far and wide, especially online, where new viewers who had never heard of him sat transfixed by the heavy-set old man describing terrible things in a flat, bored voice. The books stayed in print, and in 2012, Hollywood put the final stamp on the legend by turning his life into a major motion picture, with a respected actor in the lead and a cast of well-known names filling out the world around him, from his wife to the mob figures to the fellow criminals he had talked about for years. It is worth noticing what all of these things share. The movie, the books, the documentaries, every one of them leaned heavily on a single source, which was Richard's own version of events. The most widely seen portrait of the Iceman turns out to be a self-portrait. The world did not so much uncover who Richard was as accept the character he had written for himself from inside a prison cell. A newspaper, writing about him after he was gone, caught the heart of it in one sharp line. It pointed out that his hunger for publicity nearly matched the appetite for harm he claimed to have. That observation does a lot of work. It hints that the showman and the criminal were tangled together inside him, and that some of the horror he described may have been performance as much as memory. Richard wanted to be seen as the deadliest man the underworld ever produced, and a fascinated public was glad to hand him the title. So let us finally answer the question this whole story has been circling. Once you peel the myth away, what is actually left? The first thing to say plainly is that the man underneath was no harmless fantasist. That matters, and it would be wrong to swing so far against the legend that we turn him into a mere blowhard. Richard was a genuinely dangerous and violent criminal. The cases proven against him in court are awful on their own terms. Real people whose lives he ended over money or out of fear of being exposed. And the true number may sit a little higher than the courtroom tally, since even the doubtful investigator who knew him best allowed that the real figure might climb to perhaps 15. A man who takes that many lives is not a small story. He is a frightening one. But there is an enormous distance between a frightening criminal and the towering figure of the legend, and the evidence does not stretch across that gap. The picture of a globe-trotting professional for the mob, trusted with its biggest and most famous jobs, the man behind a string of historic underworld events with a personal total in the hundreds.
that picture has no real support. The people in the best position to confirm it, the agents, the investigators, the actual mob insiders, have mostly brushed it aside. The truth lands in the uncomfortable middle. A real and dangerous man who did terrible, provable things, dressed up after the fact in a costume far grander than the facts allow.
Which raises the most interesting question of all. And it is not really about Richard. It is about us. Why has the legend held up so well, even after so many people pointed out the holes in it? The answer says something uncomfortable about what audiences want. The cool, calm, all-powerful professional is simply a better story than the messy truth. A man in complete command of who carries on and who does not is thrilling in a dark way. A robber and crew boss covering his own mistakes, lying to inflate himself, and frightening his own household is not thrilling. It is just grim. Given the choice between those two versions, the culture reached for the monster who seemed in control and quietly looked past the smaller, sadder man who was mostly just brutal and afraid. And that choice comes at a price, because it buries the part of the story that most deserves to be remembered. When we picture Richard as a slick underworld weapon, we lose sight of who he most certainly harmed. Not famous gangland enemies, the people closest to him. The business contacts who trusted him enough to show up to a meeting. The crew members who worked at his side. And above all, the wife and children who shared his home and lived for years inside his temper, his threats, and the fear he carried through the front door every single day. They are the ones who paid the most reliable price for who Richard was, and the legend, with all its glamour, tends to leave them out of the picture completely. That is the quiet tragedy hiding beneath the loud one. The story sold to the world is the tale of a master of the underworld. The story the evidence actually tells is of a violent man whose surest damage was done to the handful of people who could not get away from him. One version makes a great movie, the other is simply true. So we are left holding two very different men who happen to share a name. There is Richard the Legend, the deadliest figure the mob ever produced. Calm and untouchable, and almost too large to be real. And there is Richard the Record, a New Jersey criminal proven responsible for a handful of lives, frightening in a far more ordinary way. Deciding which one is the real Iceman is not simple trivia, because the answer settles what this whole story was ever truly about. So before we close the book on him for good, it is worth gathering all of it together one final time and asking what this strange, sad, frightening life actually leaves behind. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.